All right, good evening. It's been hectic, but thank you for your patience. And thank you all for coming, being here today with us. And welcome to the second event of the Critical Chinese Humanity Colloquium Series. My name is Kolu. I'm assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. And I'm very honored today to be also the host of today's event. And before we start, I would like to first express our gratefulness to our sponsors, Weatherhead East Asian Institute, the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society, and the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures. I'd also like to give a special thank you to Peter Chen, our graduate assistant, for helping with all the publicity, logistics, and also the technical aspect of today's hybrid event. And it is my great honor today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Yin Shouhu. Dr. Yin received his PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. He's currently assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Columbia. Professor Yin is a China historian working on the intellectual cultural history of China and the Inner Asia from the 10th century through the 17th century. He has written prolifically on a wide range of topics, including rhetoric, especially rhetorical learning, and political thought and political philosophy, and bureaucratic culture and bureaucracy, especially bureaucratic culture, reflected in the official documents and also historiography. He has articles in several journals, including Tongbao, the Journal of Asian Studies, the Journal of Chinese History, and Korean Studies. And what is also very fascinating about Professor Yin's work is that with the knowledge of more than 10 languages, Dr. Yin also often in his research moves beyond the China proper and situate the Sinitic culture within a Eurasian and global context, and trying to examine the political expressions in the Sinitic culture and how those political expressions can contribute to a global intellectual history. Professor Yin has just completed his first book, manuscript, The China That Could Have Been, A Shared History of Rhetoric and Political Thought, 1100 to 1600, which we'll be hearing more about. Meanwhile, Professor Yin also working on two other book-length projects. One is on a local attempt, I think it's the 12th century Sichuan, a local attempt at democracy and democratic reform, and how it's related to the local politics and institution at the time. And the other book project is on Manchu historiography on the Ming Dynasty. And today, Professor Yin will share with us his research on rhetoric and political thoughts in Middle Period China and the larger Sinitic world. Before I turn things to Professor Yin, I would just like to end the introduction with a few words about how we use the next 90 minutes of today's event, because it is our hope that this colloquium can become a platform where the guest speaker can present their research, share their research to us in the lecture format, but also we hope that it could be a platform where the speaker can engage in a more informal manner in conversation with interlocutor, exploring more some of the key terms and concepts emerging in the research. So, and also it's very fitting for today's topic, the rhetoric and verbal engagement. So we definitely have to have conversation. So here's the plan for today. For the 90 minutes, we'll divide into three parts. First, Professor Yin will share with us his research about the topic today, and then after that, using the privilege of host today, I will engage with Professor Yin in a conversation about his book manuscript and his research, perhaps singling out some of the ideas for further examination, which hopefully will help open up a discussion and also give Professor Yin a chance to elaborate more on some of the issues that he couldn't include in the talk. So with that, and after that, and there will be 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A from the audience, both in person and online. And then with that, I will stop here and then turn things over to Professor Yin. And please join me in welcoming Professor Yin.
Thank you so much, Professor Kolu, for this supremely kind introduction, and many thanks for everyone for coming to this event during such a busy moment of the semester. Let me double check. Can everyone hear me clearly, especially those sitting in the back and for those on Zoom? So today, I want to invite all of us to explore some new approaches to history and political thinking. The focus of this journey will be China, or more specifically speaking, the China that could have been. Before introducing my subject matter, I would like to invite all of us to join me in a thought experiment. Let us imagine that today we train our students in the following way. In almost every compulsory examination they need to take, GRE, SAT, LSAT, etc., they need to write some official documents on behalf of someone else in history. A typical assignment can be, imagine that you are a citizen of Massachusetts in 1870, and you are tasked to create the historical petition in support of women's suffrage. You need to adopt their perspective and imitate their language and style. The assignment can also involve some counterfactual history. Let us imagine that you are in 1968. You need to create a speech on behalf of Martin Luther King, as if he is going to run for the presidential election, or even as if he were elected as a president. What the document would be like. As such, the students need to familiarize themselves not only with the histories of women's suffrage civil rights movement, but also with the genre, petition, speech, etc. I bet we might need a curriculum for that, but what I am sure is that many very creative students will come up with very creative imaginations of what the United States could have been, what these people could have said. We don't have such a curriculum here, now, at least not in GRE or SAT, but such an educational component did exist and flourished in East Eurasia, specifically China, Korea, and Vietnam, specifically from the 14th to the 18th and 19th centuries. This curriculum trains students to write official documents in the language of literary Sinitic, which is a very important language of administration and diplomacy in these areas. A defining feature of this curriculum is precisely that the students are tasked to write documents not in the voice of themselves, but on behalf of someone else in history. So prompts would include, for instance, a Korean student who will be tasked to craft a petition on behalf of a palace lady of Han Dynasty China, while a student in Vietnam might be tasked to write the edict on behalf of historical emperor in China who were precisely at the moment of sending a troop to invade in their own territory. What when millions of individuals were trained in this way as a part of their general education? They reimagined, long story short, what these figures could have said. They theorized in their own ways what an individual can aspire to do and to be in a complicated political system. They re-envisioned what China could be or should be. And they critically recognized that the political order in which they find themselves only one of the possible iterations. They transformed the world of political thinking. The China could have been is the manuscripts that I just completed. It focuses on this shared curriculum that has long sunk into oblivion. It is an archaeology of the experiences of studying this curriculum, but it is also an archaeology of the intellectual creativity stemming from that. As such, I seek to explore a relatively new way of writing history, and its novelty comprises from maybe 4 dimensions. The first is that I direct our attention to a much overlooked corpus of sources in the study of intellectual history. That is, the very formal-like genres, bureaucratic documents, central to the maintenance of a large governmental institution. Second, instead of taking these documents or ideas as a finalized product, I simply describe the totality of experiences of developing these skills, testing these ideas, or even abandoning these ideas. So when I speak of a rhetorical curriculum, I refer not only to the structured systematic training, I'm also referring to the totality of experience of developing these skills, developing ideas. Thus, third and relatedly, I want to dive into what I call the everyday process of thinking. That is how individuals engage in very creative imaginations while adhering to existing power structure, while following these formulas of genres, or while pursuing very pragmatic, mundane goals. In other words, rather than assuming this kind of power structure, genre formula for everyday pursuits necessarily negates intellectual creativity, I take them as a sui generis arena of thinking. And as such, diving into this arena of thinking, I seek to write a kind of intellectual history that provincialized Europe or decenter Europe while provincialized China. And let me explain what I mean by that while unpack my argument. My argument is threefold, of three kind of geographical scopes. First, I trace how imperial policies and cultural interactions shaped this curriculum. I want to show specifically there is a historical kind of connection of the Sinitic sphere in white and the Indo-Asian sphere and Persian sphere as deeply connected, was deeply connected in the way that previously we did not recognize. The connection is so deep to the extent that in order to appreciate the formation and transformation of a Sinitic curriculum, it is productive, if not imperative, to engage the Indo-Asian and Persian traditions. Second, I take the macro regions as my focus. The book manuscript will primarily be focusing on the lower Yangtze Delta, the North China Plain, and the Korean Peninsula. And I'm currently working to integrate the experience of Yunnan Guizhou borderland and the North Vietnam into the big picture. In each case, I excavate how local individuals experimented with bureaucratic writing, testing new possibilities of speaking and doing things within a bureaucratic empire. Third and last, I situate the intellectual innovations in these different locales of the Sinitic sphere against the broader backdrop of global connections and disconnections. I want to show that the intellectual divergence between these macro regions is far more phenomenal and important than the often essentialized contrast between the East and the West. My ultimate goal, accordingly, is to shift the focus to all individuals and to their shared experiences of broadening the scope of political imagination. In other words, it is not so much, not just an intellectual history from below. Rather, it is intellectual history from the arenas that have been traditionally denied as thinking, traditionally denied as being of intellectual merit. The three-tier argument, Eurasian interaction, local innovation, and global significance, is built upon archival work in a lot of places during the pandemic COVID. I have a lot of stories to tell about that. In terms of 2-week kind of quarantine, I did it 6 times. We can go back to that if we have interest. For the rest of my presentation, I want to zoom in on 2 episodes, respectively of the early 14th and early 17th century. Thus, in lieu of a traditional book presentation, my talk today is a recrafted, standalone articulation of my argument and vision. In each episode, we shall see how creative political thinking come out of the process of seemingly tedious rhetorical training. With episode 1, I want to zoom in on the Yangtze Delta within the Mongol world, exploring connections and between the Chinese and the Persian ones and the Mongol rule. With episode 2, I situate the Korean kingdom in the context of 17th century globalization, exploring the recreation of women's voices in the context of imperial politics. Together, hopefully, these 2 episodes can offer some access to the transformations from the 14th to the early 17th century. And if we have interest in earlier or later centuries, and we can go back to that during the Q&A. Episode 1, Let us imagine that it is 1314 now, and all of us are participating in the civil service examination, the Jiangzhou provincial examination. We are seated in the examination hall and we receive a prompt as such. And now collectively, we need to crack it. First thing first, we have a technical word here. The ni I translate as imitative draft. Because this word has two layers of meanings. On the one hand, it signifies a kind of literary imitation, imitating a style, but on the other hand, it's also a bureaucratic jargon. Any document without a final signature is a ni draft. As such, we need to produce a document on behalf of historical empire, which is the Tang, which is 500 years before that period. And we need to use this document to employ a specific person named Yang Chen to a specific position. As such, minimally, we need to have some background knowledge about who this Yang Chen is, what kind of official position is it, and what is the formula of a Tang Dynasty appointment edict, and how should this edict lay out the argument for employing this person. And for all kinds of this specific knowledge, we need training. This is what I mean by rhetorical curriculum to further clarify this key term that I am using. Before trying to crack this prompt, let us remind ourselves about the significance of the date, which is 1314. It is actually the first time that the Mongol Empire implemented the civil service examination. It is 35 years after their conquest of entire China. It is 80 years after their conquest of North China. Even more importantly, 1314 is also the first time in Chinese history that an examination candidate will be tasked to write either a decree, an appointment edict, or a memorial in the context of provincial exam. These three genres are actually of importance that I shall return to that later. What happened after all? That there was an examination in 1314 and not earlier. The received narrative is one built on the Chinese sources. The story is this. The Han Chinese officials, especially those new Confucians, they devote themselves to Zhuxi's teachings. They convinced the Mongol rulers of the merit of selecting officials based on Zhuxi's teaching. But scrutinizing the Chinese sources, I actually realized there's a problem with that narrative. The narrative concerns that these new Confucians, these Han Chinese scholars, they're specifically against this idea of incorporating the writing of official documents into the re-established civil service examination. They would be saying, what are you thinking about? Did Mencius ever know how to write a decree? Write an edict? Write a memorial? No. How about Confucius? Why tasking our youngsters to produce these documents? And then I learned Persian, Mongolian, and other languages. I read the sources, and I realized that the received narrative is even more than misleading. My argument, simply put, is that these Mongol rulers and elites actually envisioned the examination curriculum they implemented based on their own tradition of employing secretaries, those specializing in producing documents, or bichikchi in Mongolia. In the end, the curriculum established is ultimately a compromise between different groups with different cultural backgrounds. But today, I shall focus on the most overlooked aspect of the Mongol Indo-Asian tradition. When we speak of the Mongol or Indo-Asian culture tradition, we also think of orally transmitted sagas, songs. We often think of it in terms of embodied skills in rituals or warfare. But in fact, bichikchi or secretaries in charge of writing actually played a very important role. As Mongolian sources of the 14th century, this is a Sino-Mongolian glossary, specifically specified that from the Mongol perspective, the civil service examination is to select the good secretaries, narin bichikchi. What does the secretary or bichikchi do for the Mongols, right? And we cannot solely rely on the Chinese sources, which often come from a perspective of scholar officials who despise them. They're just clerks, li. So the Persian sources, once critically contextualized, can be helpful. This is not because Persian sources are necessarily more objective than their Chinese, Mongolian, or Tibetan counterparts. Of course they are not. They are helpful rather because they provide an additional layer, additional perspective. On the screen is an excerpt from the famous History of the World Conqueror by Giovanni. Giovanni is often kind of remembered as a great historian, the author of this masterpiece in Persian historiography. But actually, in the Mongol world, he has once employed, well, his career is one of bichik secretaries. Giovanni underscores that for bichik secretaries, three genres are of particular importance to their work. That is, an order or a model, an appointment document or a mandate, and finally, a memorial or petition. We remember the three genres that eventually appeared in the Chinese civil service examination: a decree, an appointment edict, and a memorial. Of course, there's a complicated translational issue here, and we can unpack that if we have time. But long story short, already during the 15th century, the Persian word for memorial or petition, azaf, is connected to the Chinese word for biao or zhou in the Ming translator's manual. And this manual as an order of knowledge is something that I should later in this talk. Here, it suffices to stress that the Chinese sources aim to tell a story. It is a story of the new Confucianism triumphed as the heart of the Mongol Empire. But the Persian materials, as well as the Mongolian ones, as well as William Rubrick's Latin accounts, they are depicting a very different story. They informed us that at least the document writing section that these new Confucians are so against, they align very well with the everyday work of the bichik secretaries. Here, one might raise a red flag, saying, hey, 首辅, but official documents is only a small section of the civil service examination, right? But larger part is still commentary of Zhu Xi's doctrines. How should we explain that? Well, being a secretary in the Mongol world is not just about writing the documents. It is also about embodying a variety of virtues. On the screen is one of my favorite sources. It is a manual for secretaries completed in 1366. It is particularly representative of the development of rhetorical learning under the Mongol-ruled Persia. This is a template, actually, for producing appointment edicts, specifically appointing a bichik secretaries. It is specifically specified that a good bichik should embody the following qualities: amanat, diyanat, rest, trustworthy, faithful, and upright. As such, one may consider these Islamic values punctuated this appointment edicts precisely in the way that Confucian values appeared in various Sinitic documents under the Mongol Empire. And for comparative analysis, a comparative analysis will ultimately allow us to think how the Mongol rulers and elites appreciated these cultural, philosophical, or religious traditions. Now, it is time to return to our examination in question. I hope that we have a fresh take of what the question is about. Personally, after reading the Persian and Mongolian documents, and after working on the paradigms of the rare books housed in Japan, I finally realized what the prompt is actually about. In the Mongol tradition, the cognate nobles were not really used to use civil service examination to select officials. They employ the bond servants, those of a hereditary status who have been serving their families for generations. And they are the trustworthy ones. They have an origin in Mongolian hujahul. A hujahul is a kind of a status, a name card to enter the service of the Mongol world. And the question is actually about why should a Mongol Khagan, why should the Mongol court employ someone who has no experience, no hujahul, no pedigree as a hereditary bond servant? Why should we employ such a person to such an important position? It is worth pointing out that going back to my favorite Persian manual for secretaries, ancestry is the single most important quality that has been emphasized. So you're good to go, so long as your family and you have been continuously serving great sultans, khans, and kings. Now, it is our challenge. How should we convince our Mongol rulers that a person without a pedigree, without a recorded service, without Hu can be a worthy official, meritorious official? Chen Li was one of the thousands of candidates who were taking this examination, and Chen Li came up with a very compelling response. His response is good, not so much because the language is good. Fortunately, we have the examiner's comments is FTA grading our works. So the language, the edict is plain and smooth. It means that it's so-so. It is fine. It is acceptable. It's okay. It's not perfect. It's understandable because Chen Li is already 62. For over 40 years, there's no opportunity to take civil service examination. There's no reason to practice the art of edict writing, right? But Chen Li's response outstood because Chen Li understood the gist of the question and come up with a very eloquent response to that. The edicts that Chen Li eventually composed includes a highly condensed engagement with the Confucian classics, especially the great learning, 大学. So 大学 was preaching that once you harmonize your family, you are good to in a good position to run the state. Chen Li was arguing, wait a minute, there's a gap in between harmonizing your family and running the state. That is the sphere he called locale, district, or xiang. Chen Li specifically argued that these local elites, they have flourished in this sphere in between the family and the state, and they have been taking moral leadership in this sphere. And this gives them the credential to advise the throne. So in the end, Chen Li was using the voice of the Tang Emperor to make the argument that we local elites are not only capable, but entitled to advise the throne, despite that we lack a record of service in your government. But we have our credential in our locales, in our xiang, in our sphere. Chen Li was by no means exceptional in being able to articulate a very sophisticated political thought, even in his examination hall and even in the genre of examination response. What is needed, in my view, and returning to the overarching theme of today, is a commitment to identify and engage with such intellectual output and such forms of intellectual creativity. Chen did not aim to challenge the existing power structure. Of course, he was taking the examination. He had the very pragmatic goal. I want to pass the examination. But this pragmatic pursuit under power does not undermine the intellectual creativity he had come up with. Before moving to episode 2 of the early 17th century, I want to briefly talk about the 3 centuries in between. The Mongol rule fell during the late 14th century, but the rhetorical curriculum we are discussing continued to flourish in China, in Korea, and in Vietnam. And now we have a methodological task. How can we effectively trace the evolution of a curriculum across time? And how can we effectively trace the dissemination of knowledge and information across space? So I experimented with 2 approaches. One is social network analysis. The visualization is here, but it comes with serious obvious limitations. I don't think I have time to unpack that. But I want to direct our attention to another corpus of sources that is about transcultural history and encounters, travelogues, etc., especially about how Koreans understood this curriculum. And also, ever since Martel reached at least 2 generations of European missionaries, they find this curriculum fascinating. As such, the discussions of this curriculum actually appeared in a great variety of European languages, not just Latin, but also Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, French, German, etc. Tracing these descriptions, I cannot help but feel that the Europeans are really, wow, the Chinese were doing things that Chen Li was doing. And the question was, why were the Europeans of the time so fascinated by this part of education in China? Long story short, impersonation of someone else was gaining increasing importance precisely during this time, precisely during the period we call Renaissance, during the development of humanistic liberal education. During this period, the classical textbook of rhetoric was rediscovered, and Thomas Hobbes, among a great variety of European thinkers, were actually students studying it. So citing Quintilian's lines on the screen, Thomas Hobbes most famously takes prosopoppoeia, which is basically impersonation character speech, as a foundational component in his theory about representative government. And interestingly, the Jesuits' descriptions of the Chinese rhetorical curriculum appeared in the library Hobbes built when he was a tutor of rhetoric in Oxford. My point here is about the convergence of interest of rhetoric in Western Europe, in the Persian sphere, in East Asia as well. But what I think is of even greater importance is this. In contrast to the global convergence of intellectual and rhetorical culture, there was an increasing divergence in East Asia, between Ming China, between Joseon Korea, but more specifically between the lower Yangtze Delta and between the capital region of the Joseon Kingdom. And as such, so I'm again experimenting with data visualization to trace long-term intellectual transformations. For each prompt of an imitative draft, we can understand it as a relationship between two dates. If Chen Li was composing this document in 1314, then the year of composition is 1314. And when he was recreating a document on behalf of Tang Emperor, in this case 780-ish, so the year of the impersonated and is 780. And then I surveyed over thousands of collections manually. And I also use algorithm trying to do it more efficiently. I can tell you the secret, whether it saves the time. And as such, I observe a divergence. Long story short, the Korean rhetoricians showed an increasing interest in early or archaic period of China. That is this place. In contrast, in Ming China, rhetoricians tend to focus their attention to the very most recent episode of history. That is there. Sorry. In addition, I want to stress that during the 15th and 16th centuries, rhetoricians in Korea and China recognize a broader range of figures who are worth emulating, whose voices are worth imitating. In China, rhetoricians were creating documents on behalf of commoners or on behalf of Koreans. But in Korea, people are recreating documents in the voice of men in Korea, but also women in ancient China. This survey of thousands of collections then guides me to zoom in on one piece of writing. It is actually somewhat representative of the intellectual mainstream in Korea. It is about growing interest in early stage of Chinese history and growing interest in recreating documents in the voice of a woman. This is a prompt. So we know in the year of 33 BC, Emperor of Han China issued a decree for Wang Qiang or Wang Zhaojun to marry Hu Hanye, the Chen Yu was the leader of the Xiongnu Confederation. Historically, we know that Zhaojun went, and ever since then, the topoi, the theme of Zhaojun leaving the Han court, expressing her sorrows, has been an important topoi in the East Asian poetry and literature. So many littérateurs have used this topoi to elaborate on her sorrows, her feelings, her acceptance of her fate. But there was one scholar in Seoul. He decided to do something different. He saw that Wang Qiang could have declined this order, and this was a memorial that she should have submitted. And his name is Chou Chanhang. Chou's exploration attests to yet another under-recognized aspect of East Asia culture that is about counterfactualism in different forms. Chou is as little known in Korea today as Chen Li, the examinee, was in China. But in recent years, a handful of wonderful articles have appeared in Korean scholarship, focusing on his creative uses of Sinitic genres. But Zhongming, for instance, specifically suggests that it would be productive to reading Chou's writing in the specific context of factional politics between the Japanese and the Manchu invasions. My reading is, of course, indebted to and in dialogue with emerging scholarship in Korean language. But here, I also want to raise a methodological question. That is, how to read an imitative draft. The mock memorial in question is little known, but I want to consider two hypothetical readings stemming from two very influential approaches in intellectual history and political thought. The first approach is often associated with the Cambridge School, which prescribes a form of historicism. Accordingly, Cho Chang-han composed this memorial to articulate his own political views, his own refusal to follow the king's command. According to which we might date this document to 1624, reading it as a kind of encoded intervention of Cho Chang-han's. Having gone through Cho Chang-han's biographical writings and other sources, I can think of a variety of sources in support of that. The second is comparative political theory or comparative philosophy. It encourages us to think creatively about the theoretical and philosophical merit behind this memorial. And one might argue accordingly that Cho was theorizing a kind of woman's right to politics in his own ways. I seriously consider this approach as well, and I even produced a draft, but I abandoned that. In the end, I decided I want to go beyond these two approaches. I want to read it contextually, but not in the sense of guessing Cho Chang-han's intentions, but rather from the perspective of Chosun rhetoricians. I want to understand how a Chosun rhetorician might appreciate it, read it, and understand it. I want to read this memorial comparatively, not to throw in modern categories such as political rights, but rather to situate this document in the horizon of early modern explorations of rhetoric, especially the early modern efforts to recreate the voice of women in an imperial or political context. On the left is one of the numerous manuscripts for memorial writing that I surveyed in Korea. This particular manuscript is undated, but the content definitely goes to the 17th century, if not earlier. It provides step-by-step instruction on how to craft a memorial, specifically memorial for petition. According to this manual, for such a memorial, you should start with a pair of long sentences. Long sentences here means specifically a sentence of 4 characters plus 6 characters. So 10 characters in total counts as one sentence. And long sentences always come in couplets. So ultimately, it is a 4-6 parallelism. Does this remind you, does this raise a red flag from you? Wait a minute, right? We studied the history of 4-6 parallelism. It is the invention of post-Han China, early medieval China, six dynasties. And this is 33 BC. Is that appropriate to use a style that developed in post-Han China to recreate a document of Han China? This is another uniqueness of Chosun intellectual and rhetorical culture. As they decided deliberately, yes, and they reinvented the 4-6 parallelism as a universal Sinitic language, not only appropriate for recreating a Han voice, it is even appropriate to recreate like a Xia Shengzhou voices as well. Cho Chang-han's memorial recreated a very compelling, very touching voice of Wang Qiang, the palace lady. And I think it's very useful for teaching purposes. And my favorite lines include the couplet in the end. Private feelings between man and woman, they too carry lamentable grievances. However, the gist of this memorial, I will argue, is not about private feelings. It's not about grievances. It's actually about strategizing. It is actually about how to negotiate with the throne in a way that outsmart him, outmaneuver him. Let's go into that. As Cho Chang-han imagined, Wang Qiang not only evoked these imageries of grievances, but is actually making a very important argument. To summarize it in the bluntest terms, it is this. So you, the emperor, you sent me to marry the leader of the Xiongnu Confederation, believing you wield utmost authority over me. But the reality is quite the opposite. It is you, emperor, who is depending upon me. If you send me out, then the success or failure of this marriage alliance actually depends on my commitment to my role. And now I decide that I'm not going to commit to my role. So it doesn't work. And reconsider it and send someone else. This is a very kind of summary of the argument in plainest language. Here, accordingly, Wang Qiang's voice is thus transformed. It is no longer a cipher of the poeticized experience and emotions, which has been the subject matter of the wonderful study of Li Huaiyi's book. Instead, Wang Qiang re-emerged as a very sophisticated politician who negotiated with the soul on terms of realpolitik. Now, let's read this memorial comparatively. On the screen, we see the most influential textbook of rhetoric in Tudor England. It is called a book called The Foundation of Rhetoric. Here it features one of the most important assignments in Tudor England. It is recreating the oration on behalf of the Queen of Troy when Troy being destroyed. Let's read some opening lines. What kingdom can always assure his state or glory? What strength can always last? What power may always stand? The mighty oaks are sometimes cast from root. The cedars high by tempests fall, so nothing can by strength stand. In the Tudor context, this mock oration is intended to elaborate on a particular theme in Renaissance philosophy, the relationship between fortune and virtue. Here, virtue is understood in its etymological sense. It is something pertaining to wear, manhood. Virtue exemplifies man's agency, the masculine agency, in contrast to fate, which is feminine in Renaissance political thinking. And in this oration, the female voice of Queen of Troy is to represent the submission to the fate accordingly. Against this backdrop, I would propose that Chao Changhan's exploration is of particular importance. This is so not only because of the surface meaning of the document, the appearance that of a woman who is declining the command of his male sovereign. It is rather about the deep intervention behind. It is about what a woman could have said in a political context and in an imperial context. In summary, what China could have been. It could have been, as Chen Li argued, where local elites were entitled to imperial politics. It could have been a place, as Chao Changhan argued, where a palace lady was in a position to decline the order of the monarch negotiating with him. It could have been a place, as my other chapters shows, where the government should have taken a leadership in times of environmental crisis. It could also have been a place where the foreign envoys can criticize the Chinese monarch directly when speaking to him. It is clearer now, I hope, that the 14th to the 16th, 17th century is of particular relevance. It is a period of closer cultural interaction which eventually transformed this curriculum. It is also about the dissemination of education through which more and more individuals were exposed to some level of rhetorical training, thanks to which they articulated their own thoughts, they articulated their own thinking about what might be possible and what could have been possible. As such, they were, in their own ways, in search of better possibilities. And this very heroic act, in my view, is then embedded in the very mundane pursuits of examination success and under the given hierarchy of power. I do want to talk a bit about what's next. One thing I learned from this project is that in late imperial China, people actually spent a lot of time in practicing writing decree, edict, and memorial. And once we recognize this, these three genres that appeared in a lot of novels start to make a lot of sense. For instance, in the late Ming production of Journey to the West, the producers, typesetters actually spent a lot of time in creating, editing, and typesetting these official documents. And they start to appear as fascinating to me. And it also became possible to engage different kind of documents embedded in different novels and different parts of the literary landscape. Going beyond the Sinitic tradition, I think another important takeaway is that it is productive to dive into the political knowledge of the scribes, secretaries, functionaries, those who work within the bureaucracy. Their translingual practice applies to a variety of bilingual documents and glossaries, some of which I have already cited. Starting from these sources, I'm now working on a new project on the global network of liberty of the 14th century and beyond. Let me clarify it a little bit. We might define liberty in the following way. It refers to the power or status to act on one's own will without significant external constraints. Looks okay, right? If so, already during the long 14th century, emic terms referring to that is interconnected in intricate ways. Terms of different languages paralleled with each other in multilingual legal documents, resonated with each other in translations of religious scripts, and stood vis-a-vis each other in glossaries and dictionaries, as we can see on the screen. As such, from Arabic translations of Aristotle to bureaucratic menus in Beijing, from Avestan scriptures in Sanskrit translation to Buddhist scriptures in Tibetan, and from local contracts in South India to decrees on the Eurasian steppe, different terms related to liberty are thus interconnected. Of course, behind these connections are more often than not misunderstanding, mistranslations, or we might say it's misconnections, but it's precisely this gray area between understanding and misunderstanding, translation and mistranslation that I find particularly fascinating and is particularly committed to investigate that. And on the screen is my preliminary kind of network I sought out based on about 20 primary sources in 10 languages. If my hypothesis stands, I think the next step is to investigate how the further evolution of the concept of liberty after the 15th century involves the European misappropriation of this concept, which is already a globally connected one. In other words, the further hypothesis will be rethinking the Eurocentric narrative about liberty as a story of cultural appropriation. This will be another story about what liberty could have been. To close my presentation, I want to return to the bigger questions for which the China could have been as a case study. The question concerns where to locate intellectual creativity and how to engage with activities whose intellectual merit has long been overlooked or even denied. It concerns the intellectual history of the denied. What we will lose, for sure, are the chains of stereotypes that dictate who the thinkers are, who the philosophers are, what thinking means. But what we might gain or open up could be entirely new ones. That's the end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. This is absolutely fascinating and amazing talk. And then it just gives us so many interesting materials and so many different fascinating examples and connections. And I had the pleasure of reading the whole book manuscript. I have to let audience know that the whole book includes even more exciting materials, and then it has a very compelling arc of narrative that shows the rise and fall of this kind of rhetorical curriculum. As I mentioned at the beginning of this event, that I will first serve as an interlocutor and to have a conversation with our speaker about this book, manuscript, about this research, and perhaps singling out some of the ideas or terms or concepts or even some methodological question that you raised in this talk. Perhaps can have some further elaboration. As we talked in the afternoon, that I realized that we really have a lot of shared interests. Even though I work on an earlier period, but I also have interest in rhetoric and rhetorical culture and diplomatic culture and bureaucracy and historiography. So, and also very much, I always wonder, because many of the texts that I read are very difficult court documents, and I always wonder how to read them, right? They're very densely elusive. And then one way, perhaps one person can really try to find a literariness in those writings, and then you, and some maybe Shofu is doing now to really find the kind of political thought, political philosophy, or political potentiality in these kind of documents. So some of the questions and comments I have is the reason why I said we are sharing interests, because many of the questions and comments I have are also something that I'm being struggling with. So it's so great today to have this opportunity to explore together, and then to 请教 and to hear your thoughts. So perhaps in the interest of time, I do want to kind of give the audience opportunity to ask questions. So perhaps we, I think my questions or our conversation can revolve around the genre, the imitative drafts, because you do really find that the last example is very interesting, and the 修辞 and rhetoric, and the equivalency of 修辞 and rhetoric, and perhaps if we had time, talk about China and Sinitic culture in this period. So I'm so glad that you cited in the end the Wang Qiang petition to not go to the Qinglu, and I also very admired that your attempt at the beginning of the talk, and also in the introduction part of your book, that you really try to kind of mine some kind of maybe sophisticated political thoughts and philosophy in this bureaucratic, seemingly functional, pragmatic, and also highly rhetorical genres. If I kind of may play the devil's advocate, and then pretending someone asks you, right, imitate something someone asks you, because when scholars try to find sophisticated thoughts or philosophy, they often tend to read the genre or discursive space where there's a less formal constraint, where there's a less generic expectation, right? The procedurality that first have to say this, the second have to say this, and third have to say this. And also they tend to go to the genre where perhaps the genre provides or affords more kind of a political expression than the normative genre. So for example, late Ming intellectual thoughts, perhaps the scholar would analyze 小篇文, right, from an essay or some 论, right, discourse. But I think the writings that you discuss there, as everybody can see, is a very formulaic. Some of them are highly rhetorical. In the sense that there's a curriculum behind, right? There's a steps I need to follow in writing those kind of essay. So, and there's some of the cases that is really the writer assumes the voice of another. So there's a blurred boundary of what the author kind of his or her thoughts versus the historical person's voice or thought. So I'm just wondering, so if you find kind of this tension between, on the one hand, that you focus on this very, the writing that's premised on this procedurality, that's very rhetorical. On the other hand, you try to locate the creativity of political thought and political philosophy. I think, in other words, what kind of possibility or limitation that this genre, this imitative drafting, or even the 四六 parallel prose, this kind of writing, what kind of possibility, what kind of limitation this genre gives to the writer of this kind of writing in expressing their political thoughts?
Yeah. Shall I respond to that first? Or?
Right.
Yeah.
It's very casual. Feel free.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Kolu. Actually, in the afternoon, Professor Kolu gave me a much kind of stronger version of challenge. I think let me try to do that version. As Professor Kolu has very insightfully pointed out, the form, right? The 4-6, the form is something that inherent to the articulation of thought. As the form is so constrained, then how shall we, in terms of interpretation, how can we be certain that we are mining intellectual creativity instead of working with the beautitude of the form, right? This is Professor Kolu's wonderful contribution to this. And I think I have been puzzled by this in my own way as well. I think in terms of the overall framework or methodology, I'm trying to propose that to work us beyond the binary in terms of constraints and creativity. But I think there's a lot of work, both in terms of philosophy and practice, that is still awaiting for further exploration. I think very importantly, first, the formal nature is something that we want to further recognize. The adroit nature of working with form is something that we want to go deeper into. And the second thing I think very importantly is that we don't want to lose insight of the greatness of those individuals who actually challenges these forms, right? I think to recognize the everyday kind of creativity embedded in these kind of formulaic genres will eventually allows us to further appreciate, as you mentioned, those who write treatises or use other genres, who use more experimental uses of languages to challenge these boundaries. Eventually, recognizing everyday thinking will help us to think more about the greatness of other forms of intellectual creativity.
Yeah, thank you. I really like the comment about the challenging environment between the creativity and constraint, right? Especially true for poetry, right? That's long been dismissed as a kind of genre that lacks originality, is just devoid of any individuality. But sometimes, a lot of times, I think there's a kind of modern theory on this kind of how procedurality can be conceived as a kind of innovative approach to representing the world and experience. Yeah, and I think this kind of because the Silio is kind of strikes to me because I'm working on the Silio parallel prose, painstakingly working on the Silio parallel prose for a long time because it's very difficult, and sometimes it's very difficult to get their argument because it's sometimes it's both convoluted and it's also subject to parallelism. That when you say one thing, then that means in the next you have to say its opposite, right? And that's sometimes it can distract the author from making our argument.
Yeah.
So I think sometimes how to think about the thought and form, not as a kind of container and the thing contained, but how thought is actually affected by the form that it is. And you also mentioned the everyday creativity, which is because you gave us these two examples, and they're both very fascinating. And I also know that in your book, you kind of situate them in a broader intellectual history and a social network. And then you coined the term Republic Memorial. And then do you want to elaborate more on that, to put these two persons in a kind of a group that perhaps that's a way of really show that this form is not only kind of a personal undertake, but it's actually reach out to the wider community that these two figures were in.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Republic memorials refers to a specific phenomenon in late 16th century East Asia. It means that in classrooms in Beijing, in Seoul, in a lot of places in China, I'm not sure about other places in Korea beyond Seoul, intellectual elites are writing on the same prompt. The prompt being, how should the Korean king express gratitude to the Ming emperor on correcting the following issue concerning the lineages of the founding the Joseon kingdom in the institutional canons of the Ming dynasty. It's very important for the Joseon kingdom. It is surprisingly is ended up being very important in the training of the Hanling bachelors in the Ming context. Basically, in the late 16th century, if you want to be a top-tier decision maker in Ming, you have to go through these kind of trainings. So in the end, people in the classrooms, they are writing on the same prompts. Like it will be a little bit like today, people like in New York or in Beijing are writing on the same prompt of a certain guy coming to New York from Beijing. It's a bad analogy, but you get what I mean. With this kind of setting, I want to characterize a kind of a mode that is a kind of everydayness. You go to the classroom, you have books around you, and you were given a prompt, and you write it, and you have your teacher grading it. This is good. this is not that good. The tonal harmony does not work here. And as such, in this very kind of, I would say mundane purpose, it's also mundane because it's your advisor, your teacher grading your work. And you want to convince them that I'm doing something good and employ me in the future as a minister. And these kind of power structure and mundane pursuits are so kind of intertwined together, but still, they are trying to say something that is, they are trying to challenge the boundaries in their own way. So my observation is rather that in the Ming context, these Ming trainees were trying to say, the Korean envoys, they have been too polite. It is us, the Ming dynasty, Ming emperors, who got everything wrong. And they are pissed off. And why they are so polite? They should be able to directly criticize the Ming emperor, insisting upon correcting this as soon as possible. It is this kind of experiments that are coming out of the kind of very mundane processes that I want this assignment to be graded well, that I find interesting.
Thank you very much. It's the mundaneness and then this kind of community where everyone kind of participates in this kind of discourse and also discuss the same kind of the same topic and being rated by a teacher, just very similar to college entrance examination. That's the 作文 part, where everybody had to write the same kind of essay, and then there's also kind of specific format or specific kind of steps you have to follow. But then I think in your book you mentioned that this kind of imitative drafting gradually disappeared in the 18th century, I think. And why is that? Is it because this kind of community was replaced by some other ways of engaging politically with the community that these were in and with the center or the cultural center?
Oh, thank you for pointing to this. This is a complicated part of 17th and 18th century transformations. I think 17th century, the prompts tend to be very kind of focused on state of affairs, current state of affairs. It ends up being increasingly sensitive, increasingly related to, in the late Ming context, the Manchu attack in Liaodong. And in the Qing context, there are even prompts about the war with Zhengao. And even though it's memorial writing, it is congratulating the throne on having achieved something, the content became increasingly sensitive to the extent that 1757, Qianlong no longer felt comfortable with that. Don't do that anymore. Let's replace that with poetry. And relatedly, late 17th century, this also served as a platform for anti-Manchu kind of campaign. They actually disseminate these writings about China could have been a place that have successfully defeated the Manchus. In the late 17th century, they actually printed such menus. They actually tried to mass produce that, reminding people at that moment, we have a hope. If we did things right, we can save our country. And they ended up being a target of censorship already in the Shunzhi era, and a lot of them were further destroyed during the Siku project. I'm not saying that these reasons are the kind of only reasons. In Wei Yuan's collection, actually, we still find these kind of practices. And I actually have, I'm trying to contextualize that in a way that is kind of going beyond my peer of expertise. And also, if we read like late Qing novels like Qing Huayuan, right, these documents are fabulous. In a certain sense, they are still trying to kind of recreate documents in a certain way, but definitely in a way that is very different from what is the situation before 1757, when it's an integral part of the training.
Oh, it's so fascinating. It's kind of this politics of the image drafting writings actually surfaced in the 18th century. It's just really interesting to me that in the 6th dynasty, where this kind of writing was very important, almost kind of you have to write right, when you get appointment, when you try to decline appointment, and you have to write this parallel prose. And then there were many daixie at the time that the kind of high beats Shen Yue, and then he would kind of write this kind of thank the emperor for enjoying this appointment or declining on behalf of some generals. But there wasn't this or evidence of this kind of curriculum. But then later, in later periods, it seemed that this becomes something that had to be learned. There's a curriculum, and then after the 18th century, this disappeared again. That we don't see the many this kind of writing being written or discussed. If you want, I also have one question, but it's kind of personal. It's a kind of personally interesting to me. I'm sorry to really use my as a host. Because the Schultz and rhetoric, that's something that I've been struggling with, and I really like in your introduction, you give one section to talk about the building of the 修辞学, the learning of rhetoric as a discipline in 20th century China, and also the equivalency between 修辞 and rhetoric. And then there are several of these kind of terms, right? We talk in the afternoon. The term that I've been wrestling with is 正统 and legitimacy. And there are also some other kind of similar terms where they are in the Western Western intellectual history that it has a very rich tradition. There, like 修辞, rhetoric, right? It can be very technical aspect of it, speaking and writing well, but also become very kind of representational aspect that's really creating a barrier between truth and the listener, that people can be persuaded by rhetoric. And then 词 too, or 文 or 言, there are several terms that were overlapping. So for a global intellectual history, for project on global intellectual history, so how to deal with this kind of terms that's especially working on pre-modern periods, that's there's a kind of not. I think that actually that last example is actually quite a good way to really respond to this, right? The 自由 and liberty. But do you have in your writing, kind of writing these projects, have you encountered any kind of difficulty in thinking about term with very kind of very heavy cultural baggage in one tradition, that we had to use that as sometimes expediency, or sometimes it has some kind of theoretical implication to discuss a non-Western tradition?
Thanks a lot for another wonderful question. I know Professor Ko Lu many years ago had a heroic presentation on this subject matter that many people cited. Unfortunately, I was not there. And the interconnection between rhetoric and 修辞 or Rhetorical is also a part of Professor Lydia Liu's translingual practice. It's a wonderful study, also kind of reveals the deeper connection there. What I'm trying to do is that to think a little bit more about the dynamics, about discipline formation, or dynamic process of how knowledge was categorized, so that we group them together in one way or another. So recently, Professor Zhu Gang of Fudan University was making the arguments of the divergence of literary and historical studies was not unique to the Western tradition. 11th century was also witnessing this kind of one and the divergence. And interesting, what I'm observing is that specifically during the long 14th century, after 1314, literature specifically in Lower Yangtze Delta was specifically considering the 词 learning as kind of different from Wen and Shi. And this kind of momentum that, well, 词 learning is sui generis, is on its own. It is, it reorganizes historical knowledge because it produces its own menu. It engages, well, it takes inspiration from literary studies, but it cannot be assimilated to that. This kind of awareness in late 14th century Lower Yangtze Delta is particularly kind of phenomenal, striking to me. It is this kind of dynamism that strikes me as kind of worth kind of thinking from comparative perspective, especially, for instance, in comparison with rhetorical, eloquence study, well, the studies of eloquence in other contexts. This is a kind of, 18th century is another important period producing the order of things, under the Siku Quanshu project, especially the abstracts. These scholars have a particular commitment. They are Kaozhen scholars committed to evidential scholarship. They're committed to some kind of poetics, and as they find imitative drafting ridiculous. So in the kind of order of things that the 18th century scholars created, this kind of pursuit as a discipline subject matter disappeared. It was re-reduced as a section of historical learning, misleading historical learning, a subsection of literary composition, not very good literary composition. And as such, as a kind of rhetoric disappeared. in a tradition. And as such, I think it might be interesting to compare with, for instance, early 20th century, John Dewey and others are proposing rhetoric communication should have a department, right? But nowadays, it's more or less integrated into other programs.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's similar in the Western tradition. That is, there was in Middle Ages, even before that, there was very kind of debates about rhetoric and whether rhetoric can really bring you to truth, right? I remember St. Augustine in the first book of Confession, that when he was asked to impersonate the Juno in Fury, and he was like, oh, yeah, and then to kind of have this crisis of faith. And then the technical part, that the rhetorics often in the English department is a composition class, right? But now after the 1970s, this new rhetoric or rhetorical term there has a kind of postmodern spin on it. So it's almost feel that rhetoric is suddenly everywhere. That everything you say is kind of there's a rhetorical mediation, and that I think that sense almost the equivalence between rhetoric is one, right? And then the technical aspect of rhetoric is the C. Yeah, so I think there are just so many things that we can discuss, that we can talk on and on and on. But I do think that is really time to open the floor for discussion, for question from the audience, and both in person and online. And Peter, can you see the question? Okay. Oh yeah. So thank you for so now that we can open up for question, and then if you have a question, you can raise your hands, and then before you ask your question, perhaps you can just briefly introduce yourself, your name and affiliation. And for our audience online, if you have any questions, you can type in the chat box, and then our web assistant Peter will help collect them and then bring them to our speaker.